Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically about the new nurse story in Tome 6, and my more collected thoughts about why this tome has got so many people riled up. This will cover the critical change done to the nurse that disconnects her from her original backstory, as well as the not unfounded accusations of ableism in the story, and the deeper issue that makes it so noteworthy in the nurse's tome. But first, I want to address my own initial response to this whole tome mess, because I want to own the fact that I fucked up a bit. My reaction was a knee-jerk instant response to DBD Twitter, lighting itself spontaneously on fire for the third time that week. I'm not going to apologise for it, more elaborate on it with a less guttural response, now I've had some more time to collect my thoughts and read the full story. Now you can at least see why I don't make unscripted videos, because I'm never as coherent without a script in front of me. I don't regret making it though, it was meant to fill up the gap before the nurse's lore got spoiled in full, which could have been a month or even more. But the full story getting leaked made its existence unnecessary, now that I can make a full deep dive. Plus, I get to flex my nurse gameplay a bit. So, let's get on it. And I'd like to start by looking at how the nurse's original backstory built up her character, and the expectations that gave me when going into the tome. Sally's story is old, brief, and light on details, but it sculpts a character governed by emotional turmoil. Sally wasn't employed at the Crotus Pren Asylum for a physical purpose. She didn't have a set goal there. It was a job that paid the bills because her husband Andrew died. The core driving factor around her arrival at Crotus Pren was not the direct result of material circumstances, but the severing of an intense emotional connection. Yes, Sally worked at the asylum for practical reasons, but she wouldn't have had to if Andrew Smithson was still in her life. It was the loss of her soulmate, her beloved husband, that drove her to the asylum's gates, and his absence hangs over Sally's backstory like a thundercloud. But here's where it starts to get vague, and where I'd hoped we'd get some really meaningful storytelling out of the tome to fill in the gaps. Over 20 years of work at Crotus Pren, Sally's mind was exposed to the horrors of the asylum, which in the early 20th century were horrors very real indeed. Mental health was not properly understood back then, so asylums were closer to prisons than hospitals, places in which the mentally unwell were detained like inmates instead of treated like patients. They were miserable and cruel places, and Sally Smithson spent her working life exposed to every last bit of that misery and cruelty, and it redid number on her emotional state. Her disturbed mind was put under more and more strain by the arduous work of the asylum night shift, until one night she just snapped. 50 patients, 4 members of staff, dead in one grim night. Sally was the last one left. She was taken away in an ambulance, which was later found crashed, with the ambulance crew dead, and Sally gone without a trace. The story, brief and simple as it is, makes its dominant theme known from start to finish. It doesn't deal with Sally's material problems. There was no physical barrier stopping her from continuing to work at the asylum for the rest of her life. She was earning enough to live on, she could have kept doing it forever, because the damage the asylum job did to her was not physical, but emotional. The emotional toll that the graveyard shift did to Sally Smithson was too great for her mind to bear, and she'd done nothing to deserve it. Just been married to the man she loved with a dangerous job. This unfair life she led inherently pushes the reader of Sally's story to feel bad for her. Especially in today's gig economy, made even worse by COVID, countless people have been forced into jobs we despise just to have a job. And I suppose most of us can count ourselves lucky that our jobs aren't as emotionally damaging as Sally's. This adds to the emotional weight Sally's life put her under by adding a level of connection with the reader. It's hard not to sympathise with someone who's been through so much emotional damage without deserving any of it. This sets up a perfect starting point for the nurse's tome story, and I was so excited for the potential Behaviour hand to tell a proper psychological horror story set in the halls of Crotus Pren Asylum. I was so hyped I rushed out my Oni video ahead of time, to prepare for him losing his crown as the best lore in Dead by Daylight when this new tome hit live servers. Well, that aged fucking terribly, didn't it? The nurse's tome story, The Cleansing of Crotus Pren, has had a rocky reception. There's been demands for official apologies, immediate rewrites, even for the person who wrote it to be fired. Look, I don't know who wrote this, and this video isn't a demand for any particular action to be taken, because frankly, that should be up to the community and Behaviour to decide, not me. All I'm going to say is this: I am bitterly disappointed in what we were given, and for a little while I wasn't even too sure why. I'm sure many of you saw what I uploaded in the immediate aftermath of the tome's release, and it was a perfect display of why I don't make unscripted videos. I was just letting the anger at the story get to me and damage what I was saying, and that's why I took it down. I'd only read half the story, and the half I'd read was nothing short of abhorrent. I was viscerally unhappy with the story, and that showed in how emotionally driven my response was. Then I found a leak with the rest of the chapters. I devoured it immediately, hoping that my frustrations would be abated, and they were, but not because the story was good. It put my mind at ease because I fully understood exactly what was wrong with the nurse's tome, why I reacted so viscerally, despite not really knowing why, and blaming it on ableism and eugenics. And don't get me wrong, it isn't like those things went away in the second part, far from it. But I understood why specifically in the nurse's tome of all characters, it struck the negative chord, not just with me, but with large swaths of the community so strongly. The problem can be summed up in a single word and all the implications that came laden with it, and that word is genetics. It stood out to me as a word that never really fit with the nurse we know. It's very clinical, very scientific, very objective. It's the kind of word I would associate with a more cerebral character, whose story is intellectual rather than emotional, such as, say, the Doctor. One of the reasons for that is just how modern the term genetics is. Genetics was a term coined by the English biologist William Bateson in 1905 to describe the work of his predecessor Gregor Mendel in the mid-19th century. This actually gives us an approximate date for Sally Smithson's massacre, since her uniform has frills and puffy sleeves, the likes of which were never worn past the year 1920, putting the cleansing of Crotus Pren quite tightly within the 15 years between those dates. But aside from dating the cleansing of Crotus Pren, why is the word genetics so important? To many people, the word genetics set off several red flags, and for good reason. The broken woman insists to Sally that the mentally unwell are in some way genetically inferior. I think impure is the word she uses, and explains that the reason for her incarceration in Crotus Pren is because she killed several mentally ill people in an attempt to purify them. Over the course of the story, Sally begins to subscribe to this philosophy, and ends up taking the purification of the asylum into her own hands. Before I get any further, yes, I know that Sally's original lore entertained thoughts of purification, so there technically is some precedent for this, but there are so many other possible interpretations of purification they could have gone with. Rather than the mentally unwell patients of Crotus Pren being the impurity that Sally was driven to snuff out, I could have played it hard into Sally's emotional trauma and the suffering she witnessed at the asylum, and that could have been the impurity she was expunging, killing patients not because they were genetically inferior, but because they were suffering in the awful conditions at Crotus Pren. This maintains the emotional core of Sally's story. Just like she was forced into Crotus Pren against her will, as her emotional compass was thrown off by her husband's death, all the patients at Crotus Pren are there of no fault of their own, suffering simply because life dealt them a bad hand. In many ways, Sally is as much a victim of the asylum as any of its patients. This will not only be in line with Sally's prior story, but also in line with the characterization that she has in the game. Sally's Mori features her choking the survivor before gently caressing their face and closing their eyes. That's not the action of a woman who hates her victim or sees them as a genetically inferior subhuman, but it's an act of pity, a delusional mercy killing. It shows that as much as Sally murdered her way across the asylum, she thought what she was doing was best for every person she choked in their bed. If you interpreted Sally as a eugenicist who killed the mentally unwell because she hated them from the get-go, then more power to you. This story probably made a lot more sense to you in that case. But I didn't find the eugenicist genetic superiority angle compatible with the character we'd already had established, and I know I'm not the only one. Large portions of the community have erupted in disgust at this tone because it presents Sally as an ableist who despises the mentally ill people she had a duty of care over. And I can't fault them for that at all, that is how it comes across. Don't get me wrong, I understand what Behaviour was trying to do with this. Ableism was a very real thing in the study of mental health at the time. It was the status quo among medical professionals. They wanted to tackle the topics of ableism and eugenics in that time period, which isn't an inherently bad thing to tackle. But if you ask me, doing it in the way they did was a massive mistake, because, again, it compromises the emotional core of Sally's story. But before we continue as to why, I want to talk about what eugenics actually is. Eugenics is a pseudoscientific theory that suggests that desirable traits in the human race can and should be bred out of the gene pool by controlling how people breed based on those traits. Eugenics was a term coined by known 19th century pseudoscientific shitlord Sir Francis Galton in 1883, based on the assumption that humanity was divided into a hierarchical biological order of races, of those who were inherently superior and those who were inherently inferior. This field of science, and I use the term science in the most abstract and generous use of the word, has been discredited by the scientific community at large. But it has still been used throughout history to justify such things as immigration restriction, racial segregation, and forced sterilization of the mentally or physically disabled. The logical end point of this philosophy of preserving superior traits by preventing those with undesirable traits from, as far as they see it, contaminating the gene pool is genocide. The systematic extermination of those deemed impure and carrying undesirable traits so as not to dilute the human breeding stock. The most notorious of these exterminations was, of course, the Holocaust. The program of dehumanization, oppression, and genocide carried out against the disabled, ethnic minorities such as the Jews, and political opponents of the Nazi Party after the rise of Adolf Hitler. The language of the Broken Woman and Sally Smithson is reminiscent of some of the language used by real-life eugenicists at about that period in time. Specifically the term feeble-minded. Feeble-mindedness was a term used both here in Britain and in the United States where Sally's story is told, to essentially justify eugenics, as a way to prevent mentally ill people from being allowed to reproduce. This was a commonly accepted medical science in the first half of the 20th century. There was even a scale of feeble-mindedness that doctors regularly graded their patients on, and appearing anywhere on that scale was grounds for forced sterilization of the patient, effectively pushing people with mental illnesses out of the gene pool for their undesirable traits. The scale ranged from feeble-mindedness at the lighter end of the scale to idiocy at the most severe. And this scale was pioneered in 1878 by the English civil servant Charles E. Trevelyan. Wait a second. This fucker's here again! Why is this pickled bag of donkey dicks here again, making everything shit again? Get out of my fucking video! Sorry. Right. Back on topic. This derision of the mentally ill as genetically unfit to live their lives is echoed by the broken woman's words, and Sally herself uses the term feeble to describe her patients. It's as shocking to a modern reader as it is unfortunately authentic to the time, and I can kind of see what Behaviour was trying to do by painting an accurate picture to the attitude to mental health care at the time. But the problem comes when you think about how his attitude is presented in the story. Sally Smithson, our point of view character, the character we're walking in the shoes of, unapologetically espouses the attitude of a eugenicist, seeing her patients as less and less human every day until she eventually decides they're worthless, filth to be expunged and removed from Crotus Pren simply because they're not well. And this goes so strongly against the established emotional emphasis in Sally's story so far. It doesn't make sense to me that someone who's typically been very emotionally entangled in the story of Crotus Pren Asylum suddenly switches gears and starts operating on a completely different axis, becoming a pale imitation of a scientist, instead of the emotionally fractured woman destroyed by her experiences in the asylum. Despite how tragic Sally's backstory is, the fact that she's so willing to exterminate all these people she doesn't even see as human makes you want to hate her. And the way I see it, that's a massive letdown. From the very start of her story, we're set up to emotionally invest ourselves in Sally's life and feel bad for her. It's so hard to feel bad for someone when they're purging a hospital full of people because she does not consider them worthy of life. I know what's going to happen now I've said this. We're going to get people jumping in the comments saying, but what about Freddy? He's a child molester, but that doesn't make his story bad. She's a killer. She's meant to do bad things. And to that I say, A, yes, and B, you've missed my point, so let me explain. Dead by Daylight has its fair share of monsters. I don't mean literal monsters, like the Demogorgon or Meg Thomas, but people without a shred of empathy for their fellow man. People who do what they do unrepentantly and without regard for the damage they cause to those around them. I'm talking Freddy, the Doctor, and the Clown here. Properly cruel and vicious people who thoughtlessly damage the lives of others simply because they are not held back by the limits of emotional connection. Sally Smithson is the polar opposite. Everything about her is defined by emotional connection to the world around her, as something we've already established. The Doctor's actions of cruelty and torture make him a bad person, there's no disputing that. But that doesn't make him a bad character. Far from it, Dr. Herman Carter is one of my favourite characters in all of Dead by Daylight, precisely because he's a totally unrepentant monster. That works because at no point do we ever get emotionally invested in the Doctor's story. The emotional stakes are non-existent because Herman Carter is not an emotional person, and none of the other characters in the story are given enough depth for us to really care about what happens to them. So we detach ourselves from the brutality of Herman's cruel experiments and just enjoy the show of everyone's favourite zappy boy sticking electrodes in flat characters and seeing whether it makes their eyes go pop. The nurse is the opposite of that. Everything about her is emotional. Her tragic backstory demands emotional investment in the death of her husband to make Sally's predicament on the asylum's night shift interesting. And when you become emotionally invested in a character like that, it's not a good idea to then force the reader to emotionally detach themselves again. And that is what the Cleansing Crotus Pren demands you do. You either have to accept the fact that the character you emotionally invested in is going on a eugenicist cleansing of the mentally ill, which is a really, really steep demand to ask your reader to do, or abandon the character altogether and disavow her, making the emotional investment you place in Sally completely pointless. It makes you feel cheated. If you are personally able to accept that the character that you emotionally invested in at the start of Sally's backstory is doing things like this, then good for you, I guess. But you have to be able to understand that neurodivergent people read this stuff. People who've invested in the character of Sally Smithson and are faced with that painful choice. They either just have to live with the fact that the character they'd emotionally invested in, through no fault of their own, because her backstory demanded you invest emotionally in it, wouldn't even see them as human, or abandon their interest in the character altogether and again feel kind of cheated. Again, I'm not saying characters can't do bad things. I know full well that if I ever met Herman Carter, he'd cut my head open and stick electrodes in my brain. But I still recognise that he's a good character because I'm not emotionally invested in his life or his actions. But the nurse's story is too inherently emotional to demand that people detach from. When you're making a character you're emotionally invested in do bad things, you have to be careful to maintain the value of that emotional investment, so your readers don't feel like their favourite character has been scooped out and replaced by someone else. And that's where the issue comes from. By bringing genetics and the pseudoscience of eugenics into a story that should have focused on Sally's emotional connection to those around her, to remain consistent with her established story, Behaviour have undermined the nurse's character so badly, and cheated much of the readership out of their emotional investment in her. And it stings the most because this story was so nearly there. So nearly so perfect for the nurse. The hellish atmosphere of Crotus Pren Asylum, with the patients treated as subhumans by the staff. The perverted behaviour of Harvey Kavanagh, showing that the staff don't treat Sally like a person either. Her fondness of the anxious girl at the start, the memories of her life with Andrew, it's all so perfect. The ingredients to create the perfect emotional story of Sally Smithson were there from the start. How much better would it have been than some genocidal crusade against the sick, to have Sally realising who the victims are, and putting them out of their misery in a tearful goodbye, the last calling of a nurse to ensure no one had to suffer like that again. How hard would it have been for the emotional weight of the story to have been borne on Sally's shoulders, and to have her despondence carry the story forward to its inevitable bloody conclusion, as she chokes each patient to death one by one, rather than have her separate herself from the massacre she commits, as she injects them with death at the point of a needle. We were so tantalisingly close to having the most tragically beautiful and emotionally ringing character story in Dead by Daylight's history. But all it took was one little slip that did so much damage. That made it almost more infuriating than the actual story itself. To know that we were on the brink of perfection, but forgot the most important part of telling the story of an emotionally rooted character. From start to finish, they must hold their emotional centre close to them. Clutch it tight like bated breath. And I think I know why this went wrong. Behaviour seems to want to try new directions with the lore of their older killers when they revisit them during the tomes, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. The Wraith, the Hillbilly and the Doctor have all had the details of their stories reimagined to some degree in their tomes, and they've all been, at least in my opinion, the best tome stories Behaviour has ever done. And the reason they're so good is because they fundamentally keep the spirit of the character the same as their original incarnation. The Wraith is still an emotional character with a dark past. The Hillbilly is still a vengeful victim of his parents' abuse. The Doctor is still an amoral scientist with an unquenchable curiosity and a desire to experiment on the human brain. Behaviour reimagining some details of their stories became enhancements to their characters, not replacing the characters they used to have with an entirely different one. But that's exactly what they've done with the nurse. You can't tell me that the nurse, other than one interpretation of a single word of her old backstory, was ever set up to be a eugenicist. Someone leaning on pseudoscientific theory as a basis for her killing spree. Not when basically all of her story is so far detached from theory because it's so obsessed with emotion. You can even see this in her Mori animation. She doesn't inject the survivor with a syringe like the Blight does, or fry their brains like the Doctor. Instead, she chokes them, her face up close to theirs until the life leaves their body, and then gently closes their eyes. I say again, that is not the extermination of subhuman filth that the nurse's cleansing of Crota's Pren is made out to be, but a misguided mercy killing. Not an act of scientific detachment from emotion, but instead a sorrowful goodbye as the victim departs a world too cruel for love, life and happiness. A world too cruel for Sally and Andrew Smithson. That was where Behaviour dropped the ball. They abandoned the emotional core that made Sally Smithson such a promising character, and in doing so, turned what could have been the tragic story of a woman who lost everything. Not just love or companionship, but even her hope, into just another cold-hearted killer. That's why the story felt so jarring. That's why everyone's so upset about the language soaked in ableism and eugenics when other killers have done so much worse. Because it's a story fundamentally not suited to Sally Smithson. Guess Kazan's not moving from his throne anytime soon. Long live the king. Oh, and one more thing. If Behaviour messes up the plague story on this level, suffice to say, I will be apocalyptically cross. Before I sign off for the night, I just want to talk briefly about how hard I found this video to make. I didn't expect to spend my free time researching some of the worst things humans have ever done to other humans when I made this Dead by Daylight lore channel. And there's a lot of stuff about eugenics and the damage it's done throughout history that I didn't put in the video, because it was honestly too harrowing to talk about without totally derailing the video. Nevertheless, here we are, it's all done. If you liked it, then please do subscribe. It would mean the world to me to keep this snowball the channel's been on growing. The links to my Twitter, the channel Discord server, and my twice-weekly Twitch stream are all in the description. I'm live from 7:30 PM every Wednesday and Sunday, so please do drop by if you want to. That's really all I've got to say, except thank you to everyone who waited patiently for this video, and I hope it was worth the wait. Have a good one, and I'll see you in the Plague Guide.